This is Chapter 4 of the Introduction to Political Science class. We'll be talking about policies of the state. First of all, we want to talk about the basic ranges of governments because different types of governments deal with policy differently. Typical range of governments that we have in the world come from an autocracy, which means a rule by one, all the way to a democracy, which is defined as rule by the people. But there's lots of divisions, lots of variations of this. Starting at the autocratic end, you have dictatorships and monarchies where one person rules with total control, or in the monarchy's case, that person is a member of a royal family and has inherited the leadership. A theocracy means rule by a religious doctrine. A single party authoritarian system means that there is a party system, but one party controls everything and typically has the system so locked in from ground roots on up that it's very difficult to wrest control from this single party, so it just keeps perpetuating itself and building on its power. Oligarchy means rule by the few, so this typically has to do with a few various powerful insiders or economic influences that are controlling the government. Transition of Russia from communism to democracy, there was a situation where several insiders close to government were very influential in capturing very large portions of the economy, so it became somewhat of an oligarchy. A plutocracy is not necessarily a formal type of government, but more of a slang term for rule by money. So if we have a handful or a group of wealthy elites, insiders that are running the show, that could be considered plutocracy. There is criticism of the United States that may be leaning more and more towards a plutocracy because of the inequality and the accumulation of wealth into fewer hands or into fewer larger corporations that have profound influence on policy making, and then that influence can get policy that's made that gives them advantages and they keep accumulating those advantages. A polyarchy means rule by many. Here we are getting closer to the United States form. Most democracies, particularly where you have interest groups that are competing to influence the government. And then the form of government the United States have, according to the Constitution, is a representative republic where we elect representatives to go and handle our policy. And as far as a pure democracy, where the people literally vote on policy, there is really no pure democracy in the world. We talked about that just a little bit. Representative systems are not a pure democracy for various reasons. Regardless of what party is in power in any particular government, there is some various common factors that lead to the expansion of government. Government getting larger in terms of getting more people working for government or more expense that government is needing to spend. There are several reasons for that in varying degrees and varying amounts of influence. Wars are particularly influential on expanding government because during a war effort, the government, through the support of the people, really pulls out all the stops and does whatever it can, whatever it has to do to win that war, which includes an enormous amount of government expense, whether it's on military expenditure or in trying to increase production at home in the war effort, or to provide subsidies in order to fight the war effort, and even after the war to provide reparations for the war or to the soldiers and things like that. So even though those levels subside after the war is over, they've expanded and stretched and don't ever go back to what they were. So wars certainly contribute to the expansion of government. The world is getting bigger, more complex. Populations are increasing. Prosperity, particularly in democracies that are relatively successful, the people are getting more prosperous in general. So therefore, people want more from government. And in fact, as it gets more complex, people may need more from government because the market may not be satisfying or solving any particular problem that they need. Because the capitalist system is prone to these boom and bust cycles, such as depressions and recessions, government has to respond to those, and they typically respond with enormous amounts of expense in order to try to protect people that have been hurt by the collapsed economy, whether it's through unemployment or insurance subsidies or poverty relief and food stamps, even bailouts or stimulus packages. We'll talk about more in detail. Government has to do quite a bit to respond to that, and that it contributes to the expansion of government. Tax elasticity, that simply means that as the prosperity increases, because the more money you make, the higher tax bracket that you get in, well, then the government is going to pull in more revenue simply when the prosperity increases without actually having to raise the tax rates. Because as more and more people become more successful, they get into higher tax brackets, and therefore the government can collect more revenue to spend. And then hidden taxes is not necessarily hidden because they have to be obviously approved by government and state legislatures. But what they mean by hidden taxes here, and you can read this on page 81, is that particularly state and local governments have to get very creative in coming up with different types of taxes and fees and licensing requirements and things like that in order to help build revenue, particularly at the state and local level. Particularly with the increasing competition between parties on most all major elections, candidates typically promise things. They promise to bid things up in order to get more people attracted to them to vote for them. So promising more does tend to lend to adding to the size of government, because in order to fulfill those promises, the leaders may actually have to accomplish some of those things that they've promised, which would require additional state involvement. Bureaucratic inertia means that these various agencies that are inside government, in the executive branch, there's hundreds of agencies and departments that house the bureaucrats that provide all these services, public services and regulations. And so therefore these public agencies build up constituencies, and pressure is on them to expand, to provide the services for the constituents who do not want that service to go away. As the international economy gets more complex as to where corporations have more freedom and power to negotiate as to where they want to go, then states have less control over this unregulated global system, and then they have to compensate to compete for corporate. And that would include things like tax breaks for corporations or subsidies for corporations to maintain that they stay in that country. Beaumont's disease is explained on page 97, the next chapter, which we'll get into next time. And this is another logical progression. As manufacturing wages increase through technological advances and efficiency and cost of living increases and a little bit of inflation, all of those combine to continuously provide upward pressure on wages. So therefore, as the market sector's wages increase, the service sector, the public service sector wages also increase in order to compete for jobs, and also, perhaps more importantly, to compete for good qualified people to provide these government service jobs. So, like I said, regardless of the party involved, there's just several natural tendencies and factors here that increase the expansion of government, and it's constantly at odds with the original concepts of limited government. So there's also pressure to minimize that growth as well. Now let's look at a term, developing countries, which is the poor countries of the world in general. That a term that's pretty much going out of style now is called third world countries, and that meant neither east or west as far as in the Cold War. Cold War, we had the Soviet Union in an ideological war with the United States. It was a war of democratic capitalism versus autocratic communism. All the various countries that were satellites of those two major powers, if they were neither east or west. That was considered the third world, particularly in many Eastern African areas. So now the third world, or the developing countries, now are typically former communist countries, former colonial subjects, which we talked about briefly before, monarchies, non-democracies. Now, low GDP. Now, this is a term that's going to come up quite a bit during the class. I've probably mentioned it once before, but GDP stands for gross domestic product, which is the sum total of the goods and services that are consumed in a country. So that is a fairly useful measure of your economic output. Low GDP typically means that your country is not putting out much, and so we can measure as far as rich versus poor countries strictly through GDP, but of course there's more to it than just GDP. Now what's important to know here is that a low GDP also compares with low level of government involvement, because we'll see here in a minute that democracies and fairly successful, stable economies, the government is more involved, and as a result of that, they're more successful and more stable. Democracies, because that is representative rule of the people, democracies tend to emphasize more public, broader needs of education, housing, and health. So there's where we see some general differences between rich world and poor world, or developed countries versus developing countries. Here's just a small sampling of some states where U.S., Sweden, and England, for example, are very rich countries. As you can see, that's their GDP per capita, which is the amount of gross domestic product per person in their state. And as you can see here, they have relatively high of a government expense as a percent of their GDP. So 38% of our GDP is government expenditures in the United States. Over half of it in Sweden is government expenditures. And obviously in America, we would want to try to minimize government involvement, but still there's a clear correlation that more government involvement typically correlates with the richer countries, because of the fact that government is trying to provide a safe, secure, prosperous environment for its people. Contrary to that, the relatively poor countries, and these are some of the poorest of the poor here, Republic of Congo, very, very poor countries comparatively speaking, because look at the differences in their GDP per capita in some of these numbers here. As correlated to that, they have relatively low government expense as a percent of GDP, which means their governments aren't as powerful or aren't as involved in trying to make their states more prosperous or more stable, more secure, more able to thrive economically. So that's a very strong correlation. Here's just a quick sampling of differences between rich and poor countries in, again, GDP per capita. As we can see, the world average is around $13,000 per capita. And look here, the United States is 4 times bigger than the global average. So as you can see, we have a handful of rich states and then quite a large number of poor states. Look at some of the numbers here. Haiti, which is very close to the United States, is extremely poor. As you can see the comparison there of a $1,300 GDP per capita annual, as opposed to $52,000 annual GDP per capita for the United States. So dramatic differences between rich and poor countries. Now here's a map that gives you the breakdown of the states. As we'll see as a trend throughout the course, the rich states, or the green states, above the global average, around 10,000. But as you can see, the rich states are always going to be accumulated here in these same areas: Western European states, Scandinavian states, Australia and Japan. Those are the richest of the rich countries. And then another common trend we'll see is that the poorest of the poor countries are typically congregated here in Africa and the Middle East. We'll see that trend throughout the course, and there's a rich versus poor, dramatic rich versus poor divide between states in our world. Now, as far as constraints to development, this is a fairly broad consensus that political instability is the major reason why poor states have a difficulty trying to develop or trying to get over that hump in order to become developed countries or get on the path to being a rich country. Political instability is the first and foremost constraint because everything, as I've said before, revolves around the political organization that your country decides to do. And if you're politically unstable, you can't get your act together, there's going to be constant internal conflict, which is always going to be destabilizing things. It's always going to be preoccupying leaders to maintain their power rather than trying to build a stable country with a good economy. And the ideologies of these politics is what affects choices of what governments do. As I said, democracies, which are representative of the people, tend to spread that power to meet more needs because these democracies are typically needing to get reelected. And in order to maintain the economy and to get parties reelected, they have to typically spread that power a little bit more than authoritarian countries would do. Even in democracies, or and particularly in more unstable countries, there's a group that holds a disproportionate amount of the power or the wealth, and that's always constantly influencing government in their favor, and so not much really gets spread around to the majority of the population. And as I said before, a low GDP also restricts government involvement, which is required to help alleviate poverty, alleviate inequality. So therefore, a poor country continuously has to rely on loans from international organizations, investment from foreign corporations, as well as aid from the rich countries. So they're constantly in that cycle of needing money from other sources, and if they remain unstable, politically unstable, the money never really gets put to the best use in order to get over that hump, get across that threshold of trying to be a developed country. Low government involvement is also responsible for lack of infrastructure because government has to provide that. The roads, the education, the bridges, the water systems, the sewer system, the electric power grids, that has to be in place in order to support a successful economy. A lot of poor countries continuously rely on one single resource, such as oil, that brings in a lot of wealth, but of course that wealth doesn't get spread because they are not politically stable to do that. And it also influences corruption by having this wealth coming in to a powerful government. If the prices of oil bottoms out like it has been, then those countries are in major trouble. As we see, particularly with Russia, Russia's economy is hurting because they were relying quite a bit on that oil wealth. And Venezuela, as we speak right now, is virtually on the edge of collapse. And that was somewhat precipitated, among other things, but precipitated by the fact that they relied so much on that oil revenue. And when those prices dropped, the things started to go downhill for the entire economy. Well, relying on primary products means that poor states typically still rely on agricultural goods from subsistence level farmers or raw materials or raw minerals and sources that go to the rich countries who then use those in their industrial capacity to make finished products and commodities that they can sell back to poor countries. The poor countries have not been able to get their political stability together enough to where they can develop their industrial base and use those resources or those primary products to build their own products, their own commodities, which then they can sell then to rich countries and then get on the path to wealth and prosperity. You could argue that one of the best success stories would be South Korea, to where they plugged into the global economy and became major exporters of high-tech goods, and they made the transition from poor country to a very, very successful capitalist democratic system in a relatively short period of time. But those are the major constraints to development. Here we can see where the primary products as a percentage of your exports are. The countries that still have to rely on these primary products, such as agricultural products, raw materials, raw minerals, things like that that go into the industrial process in order to make final products. As you can see, there's still the poor states of the world, Africa and the Middle East, are the ones that are still relying heavily on primary products for their exports. And rather than developing their industrial base through having a sound political system that's going to provide the infrastructure for that to happen, so a lot of poor states cannot get over that hump. They remain poor because they remain sources of raw materials for the rich countries rather than establishing their own industrial and factories and manufacturing in order to build their economy, put more people to work, and get higher wages. Now let's look at for the next few minutes here, let's just look at a few examples of what the government has to spend money on. And of course, defense in this world of sovereign states that are out for their own self-interest in general, defense spending is a major factor. Obviously, some states who are powerful and want to stay powerful, such as the United States, spend much more on that. The United States spends 20% of its budget on defense. By far, we spend more than anybody else in the world. And in fact, the United States spends more on its defense than the next 6 or 7 countries combined. Here you can see some comparisons of defense right here. The United States, almost 5% of its GDP on defense, whereas some other very stable, successful countries do not spend near that much. Here's some other comparisons as far as what the United States spends on health. We spend a lot. We're not necessarily getting the benefits of that, as we'll see here in a minute. And we spend probably relatively not as much as most other modern industrial democracies on our education. So that's a point of debate continuously as far as policy, as are we spending too much on defense, not enough on education, things like that. It's very difficult for a country to relinquish power. So even the average American may question cutting defense expenditures because then they may be worried or wondering, are we losing power? Are we becoming more vulnerable if we cut any defense spending? So it's a very difficult decision to make. Some points on education. Myanmar, for example, only spends 1.3% of its GDP on education. As a result, almost half of their youth are not in high school. Mozambique, only 5% of GDP on education, which is almost as much as U.S., so there's obviously more factors going on there, but they only have about a 55% adult literacy rate, whereas most modern industrialized countries have well over 90. The U.S. invests this much per year for a child, and in comparison, we spend almost this much, $25,000 per year on a prisoner. But of course, keep in mind, there's a lot more children needing education than there are prisoners. But that just gives you some comparisons of costs right there. As far as health spending, social welfare spending, the United States spends more than anybody else on health care. We're currently, as far as total spending goes, public and private, 16% of our GDP goes to health expenditures. That's a lot per person, and we are almost twice as much as Canada, which has a very good healthcare system. So this is where it's another interesting thing about the U.S. system. We spend so much on healthcare, but yet we're not even in the top 20 in life expectancy, nor are we in the top 20 in child mortality. So you have to ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture if we're spending so much money on health, but yet we're not even really seeing the benefits as compared to other countries. And of course, we have the highest obesity rate. Here's some other stats as far as how many 5-year-olds, almost half of all 5-year-olds drink 1 soda per day. Here's how it's changed over the years. In 1950, healthcare costs were only 3% of household expense, whereas food was 22%. Look at the difference today. Healthcare costs are at 16%, whereas food's now at 7%. So it's literally flip-flopped as far as how much money we're spending just to stay healthy. We can talk a little bit more about that later, or to get into that to another class like a sociology class. But these are just some cost comparisons as to what government has to deal with. Research and development. We're looking typically at a mix of government-sponsored research, industry research, and university research. The rich countries of the world typically gain more benefits by putting money into research in order to maintain their technological levels and to get more technologically adept in coming up with the latest and greatest as far as innovations in our economy and in industry, and continue to improve. But you can also use that technological know-how to export high-tech goods, such as what South Korea did in order to become a high-tech exporter. The benefits of these past investments can also pay off as far as licensing technology to companies in other states. So there's a lot of debate as to whether or not the United States is spending enough on research and development. Are we putting enough effort in trying to figure the next level as far as the best energy sources or the best transportation, how to cure certain diseases, to alleviate poverty and things like that? Some different demographic challenges as our society gets older, and at the same time our population rate slows down, which is a fairly normal progression of modern industrial educated societies, is that population rates tend to slow down, as well as technology is helping us live longer. So therefore, our dependency ratio starts to shrink. The United States is at 2 to 1 right now, and it's still shrinking. This means that our ratio of working people to non-working people is only at 2 to 1, and in some countries it's down below 2. Japan and Russia, for example, they're at negative population growth, and so this dependency ratio is starting to get critical because the number of able-bodied working people that pool is getting smaller, whereas the number of non-working people, particularly older society, which are retiring in their 60s but living longer, and this also includes children as well, that obviously you've got to continue your population growth by producing children. So the number of working as to non-working, as that dependency ratio gets smaller, that becomes more and more critical. Fewer people are going to be paying for more people that aren't working. Immigration is actually a potential solution to this problem, where even Japan has been somewhat resistant to bringing in foreign able-bodied workers, and even the United States is somewhat has a resistance to immigration. A lot of that has to do with the perception of illegal immigration. And even though there is a large section of the United States against immigration to come in and to help to alleviate this dependency ratio, it's again one of those things that is very complicated, is that we have a potential solution here, but yet most people are against it. China's one-child policy was to help alleviate their rapid population growth, and it has slowed the population, but there have been some consequences as far as female infanticide and selective abortion. It's also resulted in a lopsided population of more men than women that also has other long-term consequences. So China has actually started to back off a little bit on this one-child policy, and some families can apply to get a second child. And as China becomes more and more economically prosperous, the population rate will more than likely slow on its own, because that's typically how it works. As countries get more prosperous, there's less incentive for bigger families. That sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that's kind of how it works. Another aspect of developing countries is in many countries, particularly that are ruled by religious doctrine, there's still very much a patriarchal society as to where the society is male-driven, still resistant towards more involvement of women. But most sociological experts and political scientists will tell you that one of the first and foremost ingredients to trying to get your economy and your development off the ground is to get greater involvement of women. More women in the educational field, or more women educated, more women in the workforce. So take use of, you have 50% of your entire workforce, or your human potential right there, not being utilized. Now, this just an example of one of our demographic challenges is this pay-as-you-go type of Social Security system that we have is unsustainable, because people are getting older and the fund's shrinking up. So we're going to have more going out than we have coming in eventually. So therefore, that brings up other options. Now, there are reforms on the table that would certainly help this, as far as raising the retirement age and raising the level of contributions, as far as raising the cap. And there are options for pre-fund retirement accounts where people could privatize that, but there are serious concerns with privatization as far as people willingly contributing to their private funds. And if you actually force people to contribute to their private funds, that wouldn't be any different than having the government provide it anyway. So that brings up the issues of how most people do not plan to save for the future. So therefore, those private funds could dry up, and then you'd have even a bigger crisis when these people got in their 60s and 70s and had no money saved. Government would even be in worse shape trying to bail them out. So there's a lot of interesting demographic challenges here. 45% of U.S. households with people working have nothing saved. A lot of people over 65 were employed in 2012, so that's providing a competition factor for you guys that are about to graduate from college because people are working longer. And now we also know just in the past few decades, there's been a dramatic decrease in traditional pensions. Companies are not providing pensions like they used to. Now just 1 out of 5. Now about half have now shifted over to a private 401k fund where companies may contribute to, but then again, it's still the responsibility of the employee. Now, this is the last thing we'll talk about. The Human Development Index is an alternative form of trying to measure your development in your society. So in addition to gross national income, that's gross national income per capita, the Human Development Index also looks at the life expectancy of that state's population, also looks at their school enrollment, and it looks at also at their literacy rates. So those are other important measures that could be looked at in order to determine how successful your society is in addition to just income or GDP. There are some discrepancies. Qatar, for example, has high income but low HDI. So that means it's an oil-rich, wealthy country, but a lot of its population is poor. South Korea is also one of those success stories. They're the 28th richest country in the world, but they're also even higher than that in their Human Development Index. Equatorial Guinea, a very corrupt system that relies on oil wealth as well, and they are 18th in the world in income, but way down on the list of Human Development Index. So these other things are not being addressed, even though they may have wealth coming in. So that's a sign of a very politically unstable, potentially corrupt system that has a long way to go to turn that around in order to spread the wealth to more people. Okay, so as far as the quiz goes, what factors did I talk about that lead to the expansion of government? What are those primary constraints? And I told you what the number one at the top of the list is there as to a country's development. What do I mean by that dependency ratio? And how would you describe what that Human Development Index is?